So the reason we began with looking at spirit or the Christianity of faith was first to get a model, Hegel's original model for spirit. And his original model for spirit, I suggested, was the notions of life and love. And it's these notions that are translated, or need to be translated, into the notion of spirit, in which, as I'll suggest, the notion of recognition replaces the notion of love, and the notion of historical society replaces the notion, or social practice replaces the notion of life. Now, in saying all of that, I wanted to suggest from the get-go, before we even open the book, that there's no God in Hegel, that there are no big things hovering about, that there's nothing mysterious, that all of that stuff. Chuck Taylor used to teach you, have the office next to me. But spirit does not posit itself. That's a Fichtean ego. I don't know what Taylor was thinking. So just forget all that stuff about, God and spirits and all that. Nothing to do with the phenomenology. Phenomenology is a continuation of the spirit of Christianity, which is a story about a kind of historical society. Secondly, continuing this thought, I want to suggest that the notion of idealism and the notion of an infinite in Hegel, remember his model of the infinite is two people in love. That's infinite because they don't find anything, they don't find the other person external to them. That the other is an internal. And as long as the other is internal, and he'll use the phrase the absolute other, as long as your absolute other is internally related to you, then you have no outside, and therefore, in the relevant sense, the totality can be infinite. It's going to be more complicated in the phenomenology, but the model of love is his first model of the infinite. So it's an immanent absolute. And that's the third thought. The third thought is that Hegel is some kind of modern Aristotelian who is reacting against, in his case, Kant, and the notion of law as a notion of outsideness. And his question was, how can I make the entire structure a matter of something in which concepts are always already instantiated and concrete in practice. And hence you'll get this notion in Hegel of the concrete universal. Puzzling concept, but nonetheless, be assured what it means is it's a universal that, unlike a Platonic form or unlike the moral law, is always already actual. So in a certain sense, and this is true metaphysically for every Aristotelian against every Platonist, actuality precedes possibility. It's always a test case. How do you know you've got an Aristotelian, not a Platonist? If actuality precedes possibility. Ergo, just to give an example, Heidegger in Being in Time is a Platonist, right? Because he goes over and over about the primacy of possibility over actuality. Finally, I was interested in the notion of the causality of faith. That is some way in which experience of how we are bound up together is the experience of having lost that togetherness. And that's where I want to start today. Shortly after writing Spirit of Christianity and His Faith, Hegel read Adam Smith and Ferguson, great Scottish writers of political economy, and he realized that the notion of society or community that he was using in the Spirit of Christianity and Faith referred to pre-modern Gemeinschaftlich enclosed communities. So his model of the causality of fate was dependent on this idea of everything being like a small town in the middle of Iowa, or what we call the ancient, polis. Same thing. Except probably Athens is more interesting than a small town in Iowa. So he had a model of small town life, small communal societies, and Smith convinced him modern societies were not like that. That people could be connected to one another in all sorts of complicated and mediated ways, and that their relations of independence and dependence could be things that happened behind their back, unknown to themselves. And that furthermore, the model of individualism that was already in Kant's moral philosophy was actually something that belonged to society and not just to a certain type of moral philosophy. In short, the metaphysics of the Spirit of Christianity was simply outdated. And when he began to think about that, he suddenly began to think that there was at least something about Abraham that maybe he had not understood. Something about he says, even in the Spirit of Christianity, in its fate, he says, only in directing myself from the other does the other become object. That is, when you are, to use the example he's using, they're madly in love. You do not experience the other as other. That's its charm. In fact, you find their otherness unimaginable. And hence, you only become aware of them as other later. Now, the most beautiful account of this that I know of is, in fact, in Emerson's Experience, which is a text about the death of his son. And what Emerson cannot get over is that his son has died and he's alive. And he says to himself, or imagines himself saying to himself, if love were what I thought it was, which is what every lover, every parent thinks love is, then I could not have survived that death. That is because we were one. But I have survived. And that's the terror. I'm absolutely separate. So Hegel begins to think that this notion of distance of severance, of diremption, is not antagonistic to becoming self-conscious, but in fact necessary. That you can only really be self-conscious if you have a certain distance from the other. And he begins to think that diremption or severance is constitutive of the self, and that it is only by acknowledging the necessity and inevitability of severance, or I'll sometimes use the word transgression, can we avoid bad metaphysics. That is, the presumption of pantheism or closure. Diremption first appears in Hegel as criminality, as one person killing the other. But we might think in the way that Abraham left his society, that Abraham, near his dam, kills Isaac, that history begins when one person kills another. That history begins with murder. It begins when the natural bonds of life and love are negated. History begins because life and love, as spirit of Christianity gives us, are these natural bonds, and therefore not historical, not ways in which people inhabit their lives historically. So in the Phenomenology, history is going to begin with Antigone, with law-breaking. So history begins with transgression, and I'll be arguing for the next year that his entire philosophy is a philosophy of transgression. It's about that word, the negative. Right? So only where there is law-breaking does history begin. That is, when the other stops being merely my internal correlate and becomes an object. So the question of how do we leave paradise? We leave paradise by breaking the bonds that we didn't know existed and we didn't know were there. We only ever have paradise after the fact. History begins by the loss of the object of love. So history is grounded in loss. And the Phenomenology is going to be about loss. It has to be about loss, otherwise the final chapter can't be about memory. I just take it as obvious. If the last chapter is a memory, then the rest of the book has to be about loss. And then you have to recover that loss. So let's say it's a book about loss and mourning. Okay, what I'm going to do today is I'm going to chatter for about half an hour in anticipation of the introduction, and then we'll do the boring detailed commentary, which we may not finish, but whether I finish the introduction or not, please read Sense Certainty for next time, since we'll certainly want to begin it. Well, I'm beginning with the introduction, as I suggested, because Hegel did. He wrote the preface after completing the work, and it's a book, it's a text that, as I said, really assumes both complete knowledge of the text and detailed knowledge of what was, for him, contemporary German philosophy. That is Victor Schelling, Reinhold, Schulze, Jacobi, etc. But it's also a text, and I'll be saying a lot about this. The preface is such a long preface. And it's a tiny introduction. Why a long preface and a tiny introduction? Because the topic of both is the impossibility of writing a preface or an introduction. That the preface is the continual anxiety about how he cannot begin. The introduction begins with this firm knowledge that there can be no beginning. You can't, the first sentence is really saying you can't have knowledge before you have knowledge. So you can't begin. That's what the introduction's about. The impossibility of beginning. Hence, I'm beginning by not beginning. I'm beginning by deferring. Well, one of the great Hegel myths a myth that I find even in Pippin and Pinkard and Zeep and Stern, nearly everyone. One of the great Hegel myths, of which the introduction is the locus, is that Hegel somehow engineers a presuppositionless starting point. And this is supposed to be the great thing about the Phenomenology, that it has a presuppositionless starting point. A neutral, non-question begging, absolutely unimpeachable beginning from which, again, we can build the entire edifice. And the idea of a presuppositionless starting point is the sort of idea of which philosophers are extremely fond. There are all sorts of reasons for thinking that it's also a very bad idea. And that Hegel thought it was a bad idea. From the time of the Differenzschrift, that is the difference between Wittgenstein and Schellingian philosophies, and these are external claims, and I'll come to the internal ones when we do the introduction. Hegel argued that all philosophy was historical and was conditioned and was socially mediated. And his way of thinking that all philosophy was historical was double. First, he says, in a famous passage, that all philosophy is an expression of the need for philosophy. But the need for philosophy always emerges from the dimension in a culture. That is, unless a culture was having deep problems, why would anyone bother philosophizing? There are just better things to do with one's life. And secondly, that an engagement with any philosophical moment is always an engagement with the history of philosophy itself. So that every philosophy is a crossroads between two historical forces. One, the cultural directions of its own time, which it's going to try, and in the Differenzschrift he said, this is the unconditioned bit of philosophy. This is the bit a philosopher can't do much with and has to work against. This is the kind of dead matter. The way in which a culture is failing. The history of philosophy is the other vector in which those thoughts meet. So philosophy is always doubly conditioned. Secondly, Hegel denied and denies in the Phenomenology that there could be a neutral method, that is, a method that was not also a content. From these two thoughts, it follows that there cannot be a presuppositionless starting point. If so, if there cannot be, then his claim is not the way in which he sets up the introduction will be a way of thinking about his present. And the presuppositions he will make in the introduction, and I'll suggest what they are presuppositions that were true for people living at a particular time and place, which is to say, it is right that one of the basic questions about the introduction is, who is the we? Who is we? So when I say that philosophy is always historical and cultural, I'm saying that philosophy always emerges from a crisis, which is why you can always tell bad academic philosophy, because it doesn't emerge from a crisis, it emerges from a puzzle. So Plato was responding to the crisis of confronting the collapse of the authority of Homeric text. That is, I take it the reason why the Republic begins with Kataba, I go down, he goes down where? To the Piraeus. Why the Piraeus? Because that's the port. What happens in the port? It's where all the people from all the different countries with all their different gods come in. So what Plato was worried about was the death of the Homeric gods, that they had lost their authority because everyone had their gods. So he was living in a time of nihilism or polytheism, and he was trying, and the effort of the Platonic text is to resurrect some form of authority for the Greek people. Hegel, too, and you can say, obvious, this is what the discourse on method is about. Descartes is looking at the crisis, and the crisis is that there was no space for science, so that natural science was emerging in a conflict with religion. Prosecution of Galileo. That was his world, and therefore there was a crisis about the authority of knowledge. Well, Hegel, too, is responding to a crisis of direction. And those directions, and again, the best recording of those directions, but they were true for everyone in his society, but the best place to find them is in Schiller. Schiller is a great Geiger counter. Letters on the Aesthetic Education is really the urtext for thinking through the problems. What are the problems? First, that reason, rationality, seems to lead to skepticism. Jacobi's claim against Kant, without the thing in itself I can't enter into Kant's system, with the thing in itself I can't stay in it. The thought that Kant's system was a transcendental skepticism was simply taken for granted, that it didn't solve. Indeed, there are many, many more happy Kantians now than there were in Kant's time. I can't find, when I read around in that period, any, maybe Schulze, maybe one happy Kantian. Everyone else thought, this is brilliant, no one's done better, and it's a disaster. Right? The Kant status from the get-go was both as a pinnacle and a problem. And it's interesting about his philosophical culture that it should have that two-sided character. It's one that our philosophical culture cannot seem to tolerate. It seems we want our pinnacles very small and acceptable. Secondly, so the problem is reason leads to skepticism. But this is right there in Pascal. You don't have to wait to Kant, right? Second, that the Newtonian physics creates a magnificent account of the natural world, but also utterly disenchants nature and turns it into a dead thing. So that nature becomes not a living totality, but a corpse. The Enlightenment and social reform leads to bloody revolution and the terror. And there's reasons for arguing, Rebecca Comey will be doing in a forthcoming book, that the chapter on the French Revolution and the Terror is, in a sense, the core chapter of the entire Phenomenology. We'll have to see if that's true when we get there. But clearly, the French Revolution was the major event, political event at the time, and the French Revolution, again, had this dual character, right? It was the great inauguration of liberty, equality, fraternity. Fichte to the ends of his life stands up and toasts the revolution, and yet everyone knew that the terror was not an accidental feature of it. That the problem of the terror, in a way, and we'll get to this when we get there, there's a whole way of all these philosophers, including Hegel, trying to think that German philosophy should be the continuation of French politics. That German philosophy takes itself, both in the Romantics and in Hegel, as the peaceful, right, continuation of the revolution. Still, two-sidedness. And finally, the great humanism, the rejection of religion, the new materialism, leads to hedonism and crude immorality, all Rousseau's whining and complaining about the court. But the complaints were real. Part of what brought on the French Revolution. The French Revolution is also about the new hedonism and the new materialism. And finally, the one that probably was at the center of Hegel and certainly Schiller's thought was the new individualism, which, again, the upside is inwardness, independence, individual autonomy. The negative side is atomism, fragmentation, alienation from society. So every single significant feature of modern social life itself has an utterly negative face. That's diremption. Right? That is, society cannot get a hold of itself, not because it has unrealized ideals or is partial, but because its very ideals all seem to have an horrendous negative side. That's what the phenomenology is fundamentally about. That fact. Those diremptions. The problems with modernity are problems with our categories. That's what I can just say. It's with what we mean by individual and society, with reason, with nature, etc., with reform, with revolution, with liberty, with equality. Each of these are categories. So we want to say that everyday life is constituted by a series of categorical commitments. And these basic presuppositions give shape to our world. For Hegel, our categories are clearly in a state of massive disorder. And the structure of that massive disorder, we've already seen the effects of it, that's what I just gave you. The structure of that massive disorder is a series of radical categorical dualisms. So dualism, as Hegel understands it, and I'll say a word about dualism in a second, is the way in which our lives have become partial and fragmented, and hence the reason why we experience forms of life that are internally self-defeating. So we have the utter isolation of man or nature from God. Deism is simply the way of pushing God further out of the world. Secondly, the duality between man and nature, which goes along with the idea of the mechanization of nature. Individual and community. In part 4 of the Discourse on Method, Descartes generates a provisional moral code. The amendment of the provisional moral code. Well, in order to understand what's going on with that, you have to kind of flip it around. Because what Descartes means is morality is provision. That is, his moral code is, make no commitments which bind you in ways that you cannot withdraw from for reasons of self-interest. And he thought that that was rational because to bind yourself in ways that countered your own self-interest would literally be a form of self-harm. So Descartes only understood morality as a form of what it's become. What is morality now? Descartes thinks nothing more than action coordination. It's the way alienated and isolated individuals coordinate their actions for the purpose of self-interest. That political philosophers, as disenchanted as Hobbes, and as enchanted as Rawls and Habermas, all think that morality is about action coordination. They all define that as the job. Find a fair form of action coordination for, right? Shows you that for them, they don't even realize that morality's already disappeared. Their notion of justice is about the absence of justice. Justice without justice. So the very notion of Cartesian self-possession is a way of cutting the self off from the rest of the world. Descartes again. Descartes utterly separates the notion of fact and value, and he does so by attaching fact to the notion of representation and value to the notion of desire. And his claim in the discourse and in the meditations is that, and this again is almost a dogma for us moderns, whatever is true or false is neither good nor bad. And whatever is good or bad is neither true nor false. That is, the notion of truth concerns merely what there is, independently of desire, independent of want, while what I desire, as Hobbes would say, what I find good, is up to me. It's whatever I find good. And Descartes seems to say, although he has this little problem with wormwood, but roughly, whatever I find desirable is desirable because I desire it. Hence, the world of facts and the world of values separate. Hence, the notions of good and evil fall outside cognition and fall outside reason. Hence, the notion of the liberal state is based on a form of skepticism. That's what we mean by the right over the good. We don't know what the good is, but we can agree that everyone can, chase their own good as long as they leave everyone else alone. So we're basing a form of life and a form of society on skepticism. You want to ground the world in skepticism? And this is supposed to be the liberal achievement? Worse, reason itself gets cut off from eros, so that reason is taken to be, again, neutral, fact-finding, and the like, no part of an erotic pursuit. and the mind hence loses its relationship to the body. The phenomenology of spirit is about overcoming dualisms. And it assumes that we must overcome these dualisms, find ways in which these forms of one-sidedness are false in themselves and can be hooked up with one another. So the phenomenology is meant to show the origins and the nature of categorical one-sidedness. And to show, at least in outline, the possibility of overcoming that kind of one-sidedness. So the phenomenology is a text that's going to locate itself both within the major cultural dilemmas of its time and the major philosophical debates of its time, and it's going to suggest that those two things are internally connected. And they're internally connected because, again, ordinary life is always already philosophical to the extent that everyday life is always already constituted by its sets of categorical commitments. And I've tried to just say a little bit and enough in these kind of remarks to give you a hint about how that might be the case. That the big problems of metaphysics, so-called big problems of philosophy, the nature of categories, and the intimate problematics of living a life are connected. There are Let me do it quickly. What I'm trying to do is give you a sense of what the book is about, and therefore to give you a kind of anticipation of what to expect. And this does mean that my reading is somewhat different than the other interpretations of phenomenology you will be reading. So let me say a word or two just about kind of competing overall interpretations of phenomenology and why I'm a little skeptical of them, and then we'll have a break, and then we'll come back and talk about the introduction directly. Well, you've already got the thought, just looking at the text and reading the introduction, that phenomenology is going to be a progression of these forms of consciousness, and that these forms of consciousness, whatever they are going to be discovered to be internally contradictory, and that enacting those contradictions that are internal to each form in consciousness is going to require us to somehow move on. Give or take. That's how the book unfolds. So the questions of the book tend to be, first about those transitions. How do they happen? What do they mean? And what are they for the sake of? Well, we know that Hegel's original project, which went along, which was the science of the experience of consciousness, was to write a kind of 150-page text and then use that as an introduction to his logic. So he meant the text as an introduction to his logic. And at least there are some readings, Nikolai Hartmann, but there are lots of others, that think that the phenomenology and the transitions in it depend on Hegel's logic for their cogency and intelligibility, and therefore deny that the phenomenology stands on its own. In itself, I find that reading unintelligible. For I am unclear how we're to get to the end of the book and get to the logic in order to find the truth about the transition. So, in other words, what that account doesn't do is explain how we actually read the book in the first place to get to the logic so we can come back and ground the transitions in the logic. So, in itself, this just seems to me wrong. But it's a very traditional view in a lot of ways. That is, the logic is the center of Hegel's system. The phenomenology is an introduction to the system. And for better or worse, I think that, and Hegel himself afterwards seems perhaps to think that. But in truth, he actually never knew what to do with the phenomenology himself. He never knew how to place it with respect to his system. And I think we should take it simply as a free-standing text. There are ways in which we'll come to when we reach the end of the book, that it might, for those inclined, give you a way of getting to the logic, but then again, it might not. The contemporary view, which is the view of that Robert Pippin has made most noteworthy, and I take it, if everything I've read up till now makes sense, Robert Brandam's big book on the phenomenology, when it comes out, will be another version of the same, is that the real task of this book is to overcome epistemological realism, where the thought of epistemological realism, as it's here being interpreted, is the view that truth is fully mind independent. That is, truth is simply a correspondence between propositions and states of affairs, and it's always possible that, given everything we know, a claim that we believe to be true can be false, and a claim that we believe to be false can be true. So, of course, the job of epistemology is to try to close that gap between what we know, all the evidence and our reasons, and the like. But realism is the belief that that gap cannot be completely closed without becoming idealism. Where idealism is the view that there's an internal relationship between what we think there is and what counts as true. So on the Pippin reading, and I take it we know appearances are not things in themselves, is the beautiful ambivalence between idealism and realism. That is, it affirms idealism, we know appearances only, not things in themselves, but somehow leaves realism dangling out there as a kind of, of course, God's eye point of view. Well, according to this reading, the whole movement of the text itself is a kind of massive transcendental deduction in which each form of consciousness reveals the presuppositions of the previous forms of consciousness, so that each form of consciousness goes into providing the necessary conditions for the possibility of ordinary consciousness, and hence you have a regress into the ground. And when the book ends, you have the complete set of conditions for the possibility of ordinary knowledge, and nothing left out, hence the defeat of skepticism. So, the thought is sense certainty, first form of knowledge, presupposes perception. So the necessary conditions for operating with sense certainty are found in the chapter on perception, and therefore we get further conditions for the possibility of knowledge. I'll be suggesting that phenomenology, first, given what I've just said, I don't want to say that the critique of skepticism and the critique of realism are not a part of the story. They clearly are. But I began where I did with the story about dimension and flagging those moments that all occur in spirit, that concern hedonism, that concern the absolute state, that concern the French Revolution, the chapters on religion, which of course concern all the different conceptions of God and nature. That's not the only thing this book is concerned with. The view that this book is fundamentally epistemological can only be sustained if you read only the first 75 pages. After that, it becomes increasingly implausible. And although there are ways of saying that what goes on in the later chapters, that is, what kind of community of knowers are we, and how can we have a consensus about who we are and affirm who we are, to say all of that is just for the sake of saying that I'm entitled to say the book is on the table. That can't be why he's talking about the French Revolution. It just cannot be. So that this reading, the Chicago-Pittsburgh reading, is just overly epistemological and doesn't take seriously, I think, these questions of dimension that are all over the book and were all over the German philosophy in the time he was writing. Another view. Stern, in his, picks up a line that John Finley had years ago, that the fundamental task of the text is therapeutic. That at the end of the book we come to feel at home in the world by learning to let go of our categorical prejudices and one-sidedness. Very heavy work of therapy. Of course, and I want to get clear about this, I think part of the work is therapeutic. But what I take by that is that Hegel does need to convince each and every modern standpoint of its own one-sidedness by revealing that one-sidedness in a context of series of temptations. And it's perfectly true that the depth of this account is going to depend upon, and I want to underline this, that Hegel must demonstrate not why positions are false. That's easy. He must demonstrate why they're tempting at all. That is, he must expose the structure of fantasy or hope or desire or ideality or despair that leads someone to come to a certain type of belief, and further to sustain it against the evidence. Because all philosophy is a sustaining of the implausible against the plausible. What else could anyone think who believed in monads? So we do need diagnosis and therapy. But this therapy is going to be complex because it has to recognize the depth of the pathologies. And furthermore, it must see how these pathologies were formed, where they came from. It must go back to some original scene, and original scenes are uncomfortable. But even something more. It must give us insight into loss and separation. That over and over again, Hegel is going to find that the motivating fantasy, and it's going to be right there in sense certainty, the motivating fantasy of philosophy is that it should overcome all loss and all separation, all disassociation, all disconnection. Coming to acknowledge the insuperability of loss and separation, coming to acknowledge the inevitability, the necessity of transgression, negativity, and death, are going to be essential moments in the overcoming of these dualisms. So, the goal is indeed a kind of therapy and a kind of healing, but it's a very, and this is, I guess we can here, but it's a very complex therapy because it is going to be both cognitive and affective. Indeed, more than any other philosophical text apart from Plato I can think of, it demands and will demand a type of affective investment. And indeed, you might have noticed that passage in the introduction, where he tells you he's going to bring you to despair. Odd promise for a philosopher to make. Join me in a text so I can bring you to despair. But of course, that is just where I try to start the hour, namely by saying that only in that moment of loss of self-assurance, loss of original narcissism, loss of vanity, loss of our idea of autonomy and independence, can we even begin. So despair which of course, this is not new in Hegel. Philosophy always begins in despair. It begins in the cave in Plato. It begins in the method of doubt in the first meditation. But he wants a despair now that's not going to be despair as a scene of originality. That's what both Plato and Descartes wanted. They wanted, right, a pristine beginning. Hegel wants us to despair not at the beginning, but in the middle, from where we are. So, my first claim is going to be, when we start the introduction, that the introduction lodges us already in the middle, and that we begin in the middle. Where else could we begin? We begin from where we are. How can we begin at the beginning if we've never been there? And if we've never been there, how could anyone begin at the beginning? And what made anyone think they could ever begin at the beginning? Oh yeah, once upon a time. But that's a fairy story. This is life. Okay, let's have a break. And then we'll do some nasty textual things. Or nasty things in text. Start the first sentence of the introduction. It is a natural assumption that in philosophy, before we start to deal with this proper subject matter, namely the actual cognition of what truly is, one must first of all come to an understanding about cognition, which is regarded either as the instrument to get hold of the absolute or as the medium through which one discovers it. The sentence is false. It's not a natural assumption. No one actually thought about it at all until Descartes. No, it's literally false. It's false, right? So you have to read the rhetoric of the sentence. You have to read this book. It's full of false sentences in other people's voices. And you've got to figure out for any particular sentence whether it's the voice of the time or the voice of the philosopher or the voice of a particular form of consciousness. You've got to know what you're reading. And you can do that by asking yourselves obvious sorts of questions. It is a natural assumption. Natural to whom? Natural where? Right? And of course the answer is it's not natural. It's going to, in fact, the natural assumption is the assumption of epistemology as first philosophy. And the idea of epistemology as first philosophy, that is, before we get onto the business of knowing, let's call it the business of science proper, we do a prolegomena, and we step back and examine our powers of knowing. So the thought that knowledge is either an instrument or a medium. The idea of it being a medium is, I guess, the kind of standard spectacles reading of Kant's categories. They're a medium through which we interpret the world, or an instrument, Descartes' rules of method, or Locke's turning back and doing an inventory of the powers of knowing, or Hume's distinguishing between impressions and ideas. All of these are stepping back from the business of knowing and asking how we can know. And in doing that, we've already set ourselves into a difficulty, and in, by the way, just 2 pages, Hegel's going to dismiss this entire project, the project of modern philosophy, as a mistake. Now, of course, he can't really get rid of all of modern philosophy in 2 pages, but he's not going to commit himself to it either, but he's going to try to step aside of modern philosophy and its procedures. And we'll see how he steps aside. So he begins with the idea that knowledge is instrument or power. This is the Baconian idea that knowledge is for the sake of allowing us to become masters of nature, to control nature. And that the right way of thinking about knowledge is that it is as a tool for accomplishing a certain task. Now, once you begin thinking like that, once you have an instrumental view of knowledge, and the same holds for, by the way, instrumental theories of language, right? Gadamer just does the same exact critique. Gadamer, by the way, is like a little pocket Hegelian, right? He just runs the whole thing over at the level of language. Once you begin that idea that knowledge is an instrument for doing something, then you've already made the idea of knowledge problematic. Because if it's an instrument for doing something, then you've already separated the subject from the object. So the very idea, as we'll see in another paragraph, of thinking about knowledge as an instrument or medium presupposes subject-object dualism, and further presupposes that knowledge is not the way we inhabit the world, but a particular tool we use for negotiating the world that is completely independent of us. So already built into the first sentence, he's trying to ring a lot of bells, makes us anxious about the idea of epistemology as first philosophy. So after a couple of sentences of saying why this is a natural idea, he begins to try to unpick it. He tries to suggest that there are a series of fundamental paradoxes involved in the idea of treating knowledge as instrument or medium. The first is, of course, if it's an instrument, then it must alter the object. But in altering the object, in fashioning it, say by creating a categorical synthesis, right, it leaves the object itself behind. So the first paradox is the idea of an instrument generates the very opposite of what it intends. Secondly, if we choose it as a, he says, more or less passive medium through which the light of truth reaches us, then again we do not receive the truth as it is in itself, but only as it exists through and in this medium. So the very idea of treating knowledge as an instrument necessarily generates a gap between the knower and what the knower hopes to know. This is not to claim, and I want to be very careful with this. Hegel is the last person in the world to claim that we don't use categories, that we are not involved in categorical syntheses, that we don't use language, that our relationship to the world is not mediated by language. That's not the issue here. The issue is the language of instrumentality and knowledge being a medium and a power, problem one, and two, it's something we can know before we know, which is the real dilemma. The real dilemma is, if I cannot know the world, why should it be the case that if I step back and look at the instrument, I can know it? What makes my relationship to the instrument of knowledge in any better shape, any more plausible than I would have been my knowledge of the world? How is this idea of reflectively stepping back supposed to get me out of the dilemmas of realism? On the contrary, Hegel's suggestion is that the activity of stepping back just generates a second-order realism, namely a realism about the instruments of knowledge, which is why, of course, epistemology has only been a series of futile debates, because then you want to know, how do you really know that's the true method? How does Kant know those are the only categories we use? How do you know something is either an impression or an idea and cannot be anything in between, etc., etc., etc.? In other words, all the problems simply recur. Hence, any of the other ways of trying to imagine how this is going to work out, that is, treating it like a pair of glasses, and then trying to work out the laws of refraction, and subtracting them from what happens, just get into the same, what he calls superfluous effort. He therefore suggests, in ways that Heidegger finds distressing, that I shall say is merely methodological, that if the absolute is supposed merely to be brought nearer to us through this instrument, without anything in it being altered, like a bird caught by a lime twig, pretty obscure. Harris, and whenever I'm stuck, I just say what Harris says. Harris thinks that that's a reference to Leibniz's idea that perceptions are simply preparatory intellections. It would surely laugh at our little ruse to scorn if it were not with us in and for itself all along and of its own volition. Absolutely with us all along and of its own volition. he means by that, and this becomes clearer in the next two paragraphs, is that it is methodologically necessary to presuppose that the actual is rational. That is a methodological postulate. And it's a methodological postulate because any other assumption is necessarily skeptical and therefore generates all the, what I've called, structural dilemmas of epistemology. That is, how do you get a firm foundation? How do you begin? How do you avoid realism? So Hegel wants to think about the idea that we must assume that the absolute, whatever it is, truth, whatever it is available. And that we actually already have something, a good deal of it. Because any other assumption just makes actually beginning impossible. Now, it's not to say that that methodological postulate cannot be defeated. And we'll talk about the conditions for defeat. But it is a claim that it is a methodologically necessary postulate. Well, why? Well, paragraph 74. If the fear of falling into error sets up a mistrust of science, which in the absence of such scruples gets on with the work itself and actually cognizes something, it is hard to see why we should not turn round and mistrust this very mistrust. Should we not be concerned as to whether this fear of error is not just the error itself? Well, if you look at those second two sentences of the introduction, those I didn't read, you'll see that what they both suggest is a fear of error. That the problem of knowledge arises because you have a fear or an anxiety that you may be erroneous, and it's that fear itself that generates the moment of reflective stepping back that we think of as epistemology. And the moment of stepping back that we think of as epistemology, then, is the cause of subject-object dualism. And once you've got subject-object dualism, that is, once you've reflectively placed the object outside your ken, you ain't going to get it back. So, does this structure look familiar to anyone? Say anyone who's read Remembrance of Things Past, for example? It's a structure of jealousy. Right? It's how do I know she's being faithful? I don't trust her. That's it. It's over. From that moment on, nothing she can do will be trustworthy because you've already decided that you don't know if she is trustworthy, right? She may be, right? So you can lock her in a room and you can imprison her, and even her fantasies are going to be disloyal. Nothing will work. So epistemology is a form of maddened jealousy of a certain kind, or the anxiety of the jealous lover. And I say that, by the way, not by accident. We'll see that the structure of jealousy is actually part of the motor of this text.
It's also Havel's interpretation Stanley Cavell's interpretation of skepticism and of alternative.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It's how he wants to think about the relationship between Desdemona and that's probably what I had in mind about my thoughts there. But certainly, that's the thought here. The fear of error is the error. And you have to see that that's a deep thought and not a shallow thought. Because you have to see how that fear or anxiety can then generate a series of responses. And that once those responses get going, they deepen the separation until there's no way back. Right? And that's part of the story that Hegel means to be telling here. And he thinks that, as will come out in a second, that part of the reason why modern philosophers could do this and not notice the kind of trap they were in is because they had the view, wholly unjustified, that the mind was better known than the world, that you could have non-inferential self-knowledge of your own mental states, and that therefore part of the new individualism, that you could be in possession of a kind of certainty about yourself, even if you knew nothing about the world. Now, if you think hard, just for, say, 17 or 18 seconds, imagine someone who is absolutely certain about their own inner states, but uncertain about the world. Think about what you're imagining. I mean, this is what we usually think of as a psychotic state. But, well, I mean that seriously. And I want you to think about what it means to think that we have a whole structure of philosophy that's premised on that idea. That the inner is safe and knowable, but everything outside is mad. Right? And of course, the one person who knew that something was wrong with the structure was Hume in that famous passage where he says, I am a monster to myself, I think myself mad, and then has to go play billiards. But that's haunting. But it's a haunting and terrible moment because he cannot find why there should be this connection between what he takes to be austere and rational skepticism and his monstrosity, this sense of madness. And he cannot diagnose why he has to literally put his best certainty about himself out of mind in order to enter the world. You have to leave behind your self-certainty in order to play billiards. But that's actually right. The point is, the billiards moment is the right moment. And the other moment is the problem. So, he goes on to suggest, just what I've just been trying to tell you that he's talking about, that this language of instrument and medium generates subject-object dualism and generates a whole series of further forms of deception in which we say we have knowledge, but not real knowledge. That's, we know appearances and not things in themselves. Or we have knowledge, but there's something else that's true. That's, we have to limit knowledge in order to make room for faith. So we know appearances, but we have relationship to the absolute, the noumenal, the means of faith, which was both Kant and then Jacobi, in a way, made that the center of this whole philosophy. So you can have truth and have nevertheless something else true. So Hegel's suggesting, and again, we ought to be thinking about this now as anxious. And I know that every one of you finds talk about the absolute unnerving. That people shouldn't talk that way, right? But I'm trying to suggest that talking in the other way is crazy, right? That what looks like modesty actually is literally a form of madness because it presupposes a kind of dualism, but the dualism requires that you have internal certainty and external skepticism. And that's all he has to say about epistemology. That's it for all of modern philosophy. He's done with it. So he has to kind of change the topic somehow. He has to kind of maneuver around it because he realizes, of course, that we still have these questions about knowledge and they haven't quite gone away. But whatever knowledge is, it ain't going to be had by doing epistemology. That is, by examining our capacities for knowledge and then trying to see if they're adequate for knowing things themselves. So, he comes up with what always strikes me as a stunningly simple solution. Science appears. We could, this is the middle of paragraph 76, this is the turning point. Everything about this is about the whole history of philosophy in a few sentences. We could, with better justification, simply spare ourselves the trouble of paying any attention to such ideas and elocution, the absolute, cognition, objective, subjective, adventitious ideas, all that kind of junk. For they are intended to ward off science. There's the Meno problem. They want science before science. They want to know before they know. They want to learn to swim by sitting on the chaise lounge. Right? That's the thought that Hegel's kind of running here. They want to ward off science itself and constitute merely an empty appearance of knowing, which vanishes immediately as soon as science comes on the scene. But science, just because it comes on the scene, makes an entrance, is itself an appearance. In coming on the scene, it is not yet science in its developed and unfolded truth, etc. Okay, so this is... Think about philosophy always seems to buy the Platonic divided line. Right? Appearances down here. Right? The ideas up here. And a line between this. Philosophy is to get beyond the appearances to the ideas. But what if philosophy, science, itself begins in appearances? What if rather than opinion or appearances being the antithesis to philosophy, doxa, as opposed to knowledge, what if doxa and appearances are the home soil of knowledge? Well, how can they be the home soil of knowledge? Because he says science must appear. Well, how does science appear? It appears by making a claim. Well, how does that help us? Well, because when science, any science, that is, any piece of knowledge appears, it has to distinguish itself from illusion. Right? So the assumption here is that all appearances are illusions, right? And that just is false. Rather, and this is a little Hegelian bit of logic, he says essence must appear. Essence must appear. Knowledge, or anything that is, must appear. If it don't appear, we ain't going to know about it. We ain't going to be in touch with it. It ain't going to be matter in our lives. Whatever it is, it must appear. And therefore, the appearance-knowledge distinction is something that's internal to the world of appearances, not outside it. Appearance-knowledge distinction belongs to the world of appearances and is not an object outside it. Science, therefore, Hegel says, is the very activity of distinguishing appearance from reality, and it allows us, as it progresses, to confidently distinguish between the two. So we can't prepare for science, as it were, make sure that science will do the job of getting only reality and not appearances. Rather, the very effort of science itself is that effort of making those distinctions. So our very conviction that there is an appearance-reality distinction to be drawn actually depends upon having seen science, knowledge do this. Which is to say, and this is going to be the leitmotif of the entire introduction, science comes on the scene. It is in the business or the activity of distinguishing appearance from reality, and it continues to do so. In other words, rather than a criterion of knowledge or knowledge as product, Hegel puts in its place process. Or to put it another way, every theory of knowledge skips the most important thing about knowledge. The most important thing about knowledge. Think about, what's the definition of knowledge? Justify true belief. Okay, and then if you've ever taken a class with Rod Chisholm, you'll know that gets 17 clauses to make sure it's okay. Okay. What it forgets is people learn. That learning is a process, that it's a process that occurs over time, and that's filled with misadventures. indeed full of mistakes. And furthermore, in ways that become the basis of this book, the mistakes matter to what we know. Unless I had that terrible first marriage, I couldn't have had the good second marriage. I learned something. Maybe not enough, but I learned, right? So learning is not just getting rid of bad stuff or making sure you don't get bad stuff in there, but learning is a process in which you learn from your mistakes, and the mistakes are part of the process. So Hegel is going to make process dominate over product, and he is going to replace knowledge by learning, or what he's going to call education or Bildung. And that everything that's going to be important is going to be over time through a process in which the appearances or the false moments play a role. And not just any old role, but a constitutive role.
How is that really different from Plato? I mean, the idea of anamnesis, knowledge is remembering, and the whole idea,
what could be worse than that?
well, the whole idea of the educators, the midwife,
Bring it out. It's already there. It's pristine. It's in itself. None of that in Hegel. None of that. You really make real mistakes. You really don't know, and you really do learn. I'm not saying no other philosophers had any other notion of process, but what no other philosophers really took seriously, mostly they didn't like process. I've already indicated that definitions of knowledge tend to want the product and cut it off from the learning. Truth should be timeless. No, Hegel said, how can it be timeless? It's a product of a history. Truth can't be timeless. It's a purely temporal thing. But more, Plato, like other philosophers, despise the errors. They despise the mistakes. They want to get them purely distinguished. What we will have at the end of the Phenomenology is 599 pages of error and one page of saying, I made all those mistakes. Huh. I see that now. And that those mistakes turn out to be the one-sidedness and so on, so all the complexity. But the errors are everything. They're not like things you just, they're everything. They're going to be everything. Otherwise you can't take history seriously. It's as if you could imagine we could know what the word liberty means or what the word freedom means, but that has nothing to do with slavery. Deontology thinks they can define liberty without the history of acts of rebellion and emancipation. Hegel is denying that. The content of ideas is going to depend on their history. He's going to say in 17 minutes that we literally are that history. Said it. We are nothing but that history in a kind of congealed way. All that history is there in our gestures, in our movements, and that this process is going to be a process of unpacking that history. But that history is a history of errors, not a history of the ideas, not a history of remembering what we saw pristinely before we were born and the shock of birth made us forget. What we got to remember is that we've been, Greeks in a slave-owning state and Romans in an atomistic state, and we lived in, the feudal period, etc., etc. All that belongs to us, is in us. So my suggestion is philosophy, and this goes along with the other thought, of course, which I won't go through here, but one of my hobby horses is philosophy hates children. Children just don't appear. And that's because they're an embarrassment. And they're an embarrassment because they don't know anything, they're out of control. And that would be okay, except children, as children, are always out of control. They always don't know anything, right? So they're always in the state of nature, right? And we want to make sure we're not them. So a philosophy is always about how we can be, and a good deal of feminist philosophy is protested against Rawls, right? On this matter, that no one's ever dependent, no one ever gets ill, no one ever gets old, no one ever gets dependent. I mean, but all these things are the things that philosophy, it wants a kind of purity. And the question, and it's a hard question, I don't mean this to be an easy question, how can we do philosophy without purity? I take it purity is one of the last pre-modern ideas that for the most part has no role in the modern world, right? Except in philosophy. Philosophy is always a work of hygiene and purification. Call it authenticity. So Hegel wants a philosophy of the impure, of the mistakes, of the errors, of the fantasies, of the delusions, of the egoisms, and wants to tie whatever's worth knowing to those moments. Hence, again, the very structure of this introduction depends upon that notion of the fear of error. Now, that's not going to go away. We have to, to understand that epistemology is dependent on anxiety and fear is not something that can disappear from our understanding, because we have to acknowledge that in ourselves. Hence my mention of jealousy. That these are deep structures, and therefore temptations, right? And getting past and seeing how we reify our own temptations or our own ways of avoiding temptation is what the history of philosophy has been. Philosophy has always been a search for some kind of self-assurance. But the self-assurance has always wanted to negate those things that it wanted to escape from. There's no escape. So, the intelligibility of the product for Hegel is going to depend on the process, and science is going to be non-detachable from learning. I just think that this is crucial. The test case I always imagine is if there was this pill. You take this pill, and you have the sensation of just having finished reading on a Quran. You didn't read it, that you have the sensation that you've just closed the book. Surely that would miss something. Well, the same in philosophy. You don't want to get rid of the whole process, right, by which you get to the conclusion. Paragraph 77. So, knowledge, that's a long, sweaty way of saying knowledge makes an appearance. Science must appear. So, now what Hegel's going to have to do is figure out a way of figuring out how to write philosophy in a way that can take that thought on board, which is not obvious, right? I mean, it's a great idea. One way of doing it, the one he doesn't follow here, you may think, is simply to write the entire history of philosophy, right? And try to, and of course he does eventually do that, right? But here he's going to try something else. So, paragraph 77, natural consciousness. Now, because it has only phenomenal knowledge for its object, this exposition seems not to be science, free and self-moving in its own peculiar shape. Yet from this standpoint, it can be regarded as the path of natural consciousness, which presses forward to true knowledge, or as the way of the soul which journeys through the series of its own configurations, as though they were stations appointed for it by its own nature, so that it may purify itself for the life of the spirit and achieve finally through completed experience of itself the awareness of what it is really in itself. That's natural consciousness. Great debates about natural consciousness, and for some reason lots of people seem to think it's Greek consciousness. And I can never find anything natural about Greek consciousness. And it's not the way the book begins, and it's hard to read the notion of natural consciousness as structural or methodological if you begin with the notion of Greek consciousness. So I interpret natural consciousness, not the consciousness of the man on the street. So this isn't more doing common sense, nor is it exactly Husserl's notion of the natural attitude. It's not that either. Natural consciousness is any form of consciousness that spontaneously and immediately takes itself to be in possession of the truth. Natural consciousness is any form of consciousness that unreflectively takes itself to be in possession of the truth. The claims, therefore, of natural consciousness can be endlessly complicated. Philosophy takes itself to be a series of theories about the nature of knowledge or the nature of the world, and therefore you simply begin with a theory that's just there. So, again, Rod Chisholm, who's understood, right? You just begin with, Plato, the Theaetetus, knowledge is just by true belief. It's just there. Now, of course, you need to work on it, blah, 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 but the thought is it's spontaneously there. You don't have to worry about where it came from, how it got there. So the notion of natural consciousness is the unanxious, unworried assumption that you know that knowledge is just by true belief, or that knowledge is whatever Newton says, or that morality is what's there in the moral law. What's naturalness the opposite of, then? Naturalness is philosophy, and indeed ordinary consciousnesses, unawareness of its social and historical presuppositions. So what makes it natural is its presumption of being ahistorical and asocial, and therefore of conditioned in all those ways. So the various manifestations of science appear and press beyond themselves. Science is going to be now the process by which natural consciousness works through the various attempts to reassure itself that it is indeed in possession of the truth it claims to be in possession of, fails in those claims, goes on to another station of the cross. Station of the cross. Maybe we'll have to come back to that phrase, right? Goes on to another station of the cross and tries again. So it's going to be that series. So natural consciousness will show itself, Hegel says, to be only the notion of knowledge, or in other words, not to be real knowledge. That is, it will be a concept of knowledge. That natural consciousness will have a concept of knowledge. And by the way, knowledge here can be a concept of knowledge, but it can also be a concept of God. It can be a concept of morality. It can be a concept of politics. It can be whatever, and I want to be clear here. So knowledge, although this is going to start by talking about knowledge and epistemology, knowledge here can be any categorical determination that's capable of providing the anchor for a fundamental mode of comportment toward the world. I'm going to say that again. I just made it up. Right? So, natural consciousness is going to be not just about knowledge, but any categorical determination that is sufficient to determine a fundamental orientation toward the world. That is, in each case, a form of natural consciousness will be a way of how people think they are fundamentally connected to the world in general. So one of the ways people might imagine they're fundamentally connected to the world in general is by knowing it, by representing it. That's one kind of way of connecting to the world. But if you're another kind of person, you may think your fundamental connection to the world is believing in God. Or you may think believing in the Pope. Or you may think that the fundamental connection is by doing mathematical physics. That's the only true activity. Or you may think it's by fighting a revolution, following the moral law. All of these can be thought of, and they really can be thought of, as fundamental modes of accessing the world in general. That is how people take a stand upon themselves in relationship to the world. So we'll come back to the double structure of every kind of consciousness. But each one is going to be a mode of fundamental comportment. So natural consciousness now, up to paragraph 78. We're flying along here. going this slow helpful? I know you all. I was talking to people outside and said, "Oh yeah, the introduction was pretty easy." And I thought, "Oh, now you tell me." I thought it was pretty tricky. It's readable. This is the texts that are not readable. It's readable, but it's not easy. It's not easy to unpack what's going on here and see how it amounts to something like a way of going on. Natural consciousness. Let's see if we can do this paragraph. Natural consciousness will show itself to be only the notion of knowledge, or in other words, not to be real knowledge, but since it directly takes itself to be real knowledge, this path has a negative significance for it, and what is in fact the realization of the notion counts for it rather as the loss of its own self, for it does lose its truth on this path. The road can therefore be regarded as the pathway of doubt, or more precisely, as the way of despair, for what happens on it is not what is ordinarily understood when the word doubt is used, shilly-shallying about this or that presumed truth, followed by a return to the truth again, after the doubt has been appropriately dispelled, so that at the end of the process the matter is taken to be what it was in the first place. On the contrary, modern epistemology, that is, we do all that work. We do all that work so we can say the book is on the table. Just seems, Anyway, on the contrary, the path is the consciousness insight into the untruth of phenomenal knowledge, for which the supreme reality is what is in truth only the unrealized notion. Therefore, this thoroughgoing skepticism is also not the skepticism with which an earnest zeal for truth in science fancies is prepared and equipped itself in their service. The resolve in science not to give itself over to the thoughts of others by mere authority, but to examine everything for oneself upon only one's conviction, or better still, to produce everything oneself and accept only one's indeed as the truth. Central here is the word takes. You knew that. It takes, it doesn't matter whether it is true or not. What matters is it takes itself to be true. Now, in saying it takes itself to be true is to say that it doesn't have a mere opinion about what knowledge is. It has an overwhelming conviction. So this is already a story of an erotic binding of oneself. So natural consciousness appears as erotically bound states of conviction. A desire for the truth and a wanting of the truth and a conviction that one is in possession of that truth. And that's what's important, because it is in light of that, that is only if you take yourself really to be in possession of this, will you act accordingly. That is, you act in ways that try to register that truth. And in trying to register that truth and acting in that way, you're going to lose it. You're going to fight the revolution and find yourself in a bloody terror. So that the only way that Hegel says, nothing great appears without passion. This is when I talked about categorical commitments. Let's call them categorical passions. So this is a study of those categorical passions through which people have tried to orient themselves in the world. And because they were passions, then when they collapse, you lose everything. That's why this is not about doubt, but about despair. You have put your all in the thought of the French Revolution. You've put your all in the thought of the moral law. You've put your all in the thought of sense certainty. And in the very attempt to assure yourself of its truth, in the very attempt to make it true, in the very attempt to elaborate and make a world that corresponds to it, it will go under. It does go under. It's the history of these going unders. And hence, this is not about mere epistemology, hence, the easy crack at Hume and Descartes. This is much more the way of despair, because these are about modes of world constitution and world laws. And that when your categorical orientation in the world collapses, you don't sit back and say, phew, got rid of another bad idea. Because life is not about getting rid of bad ideas, it's finding a way of living. And when the mode that constitutes your connection to the world collapses, then everything collapses. So this really is the way of despair. Hence the notion of stations on the cross. These are ways in which Western humanity has tested itself, tried out its various ways of what it is that constitutes our ways of being in the world, and found that over and over again, these great modes of articulating our being in the world collapse. The series of configurations which consciousness goes through along this road is a reality of the detailed history of the education of consciousness itself through a standpoint of science. Let us look for a moment, we'll stop here, at paragraphs 28 and 29 in the preface. They are a discussion of education. So there are little bits of the preface we might read and understand. And then I'll pick up from there next time. Over the week, you can kind of take a good look at these paragraphs. These are a fuller exposition of that one sentence that we just read. He says the single individual, this is third sentence, paragraph 28. The single individual is incomplete spirit, a concrete shape in whose whole existence one determinateness predominates, the others being present in blurred outlines. You didn't know that about yourself. You are, each of us is, an indeterminate moment of spirit in which one moment predominates. And he's talking now to his audience, and all the rest occur merely in blurred outline. Now, he goes on to say, in a spirit that is more advanced than another, the lower concrete existence has been reduced to an inconspicuous moment. What used to be the important thing is now but a trace. Its pattern is shrouded to become a mere shadowy outline. The individual whose substance is the more advanced spirit runs through this past just as one who takes up a higher science goes through the preparatory studies, etc., etc. So each of us, as I was suggesting earlier, has embedded in us already, just by having a moment of spirit that predominates and being in the place in history where we are nothing but a congealing or sedimentation or concretion of that history of which the earlier moments exist as, let's call them, our cultural unconscious. They're there in their concentrated state. Therefore, in unpacking the history, we're not unpacking, and this is why this is going to be a difficult work of reading, we're not unpacking someone else's history. We're not reading an external history, like reading the history of the Roman Empire. We're reading the history of ourselves. We're reading our own coming to be. And of course, the difficulty is that we have to learn to recognize ourselves, the blurred, traced, very sedimented moments that are all these earlier moments. So, as we read, Hegel's not going to want us to be outsiders in the text. He's going to want us to identify with, this is why people have often thought this is a Bildungsroman of a certain kind, to identify with the various forms of consciousness. They should not be reading about some bizarre figures, but they should be readings of what are suddenly scary alter egos. There, but for the grace of history, there I. So, he says, we shall recognize the history of the cultural development of the world traced, as it were, in silhouette. This past existence is already acquired property of the universal spirit, which constitutes the substance of the individual, and hence appears externally to him as his inorganic nature. That is, we tend to read this stuff in textbook, and it appears not as our living stuff, but as the way inorganic nature appears, namely as an externality. The goal is to make substance, inorganic nature, subject. That is to take this stuff and make it not an external fact, but come to recognize it as the coming to be of our own self-consciousness. So Hegel puts this in a kind of ironic way, in the middle of paragraph 29. He says, since substance of the individual, the world spirit itself, had the patience to pass through these shapes over the long passage of time, and to take upon itself the enormous labor of world history, in which it embodied in each shape as much of its entire content as that shape was capable of holding, and since it could never have attained consciousness of itself by any lesser effort, the individual certainly cannot, by the nature of the case, comprehend his own substance more easily. That's a message. It's going to be a long, hard text. If history was hard, and you are that history, then somehow you have got to go through the labor of unearthing that stuff as your moment and work through it. But this, as I said, is just like what a therapeutic process is. You can't just, as Freud, I'll stop at the Freud analogy and we'll pick up there next week. Freud said, look, patients walked into the office. I could tell the patient, look, you wanted to sleep with your mother and kill your father. And nowadays, of course, any patient who walks into a therapist's office probably says to the therapist, that knowledge is useless, Freud says. That's nothing. It's nothing because you haven't worked through it. That is, you don't have any of the affects of necessary of what it is to acknowledge ambivalence, to acknowledge that you can both love someone and have murderous feelings toward them, and that if you don't, something's wrong with you, and that you can desperately, more than anything in the world, want to sleep with your mother or father, and it's the one thing you must never do, etc., etc. And to find all that and to work through it and show how you've acted out that by the failure of not acknowledging it your whole life, that's the sort of investment, as I read it, that Hegel's asking for when he says it's not going to be any easier for us. We have to, yeah.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Tell me if because I want to just twist a little bit of what you said and tell me if it sounds okay to you. That it's not going to be easy, that what becoming an individual has to do with his working through a world history. But in both the middle of paragraph 28 and the middle of paragraph 29, he adds these yets. And the yets, after the passage you just read, say yet at the same time he has less trouble, which I want to suggest is actually another kind of trouble.
Yep.
Since all this has been implicitly accomplished. And then on the other page, that the kid already has reduced to the level of facts, exercises, and games for children, what occupied the minds of mature men for generations before.
Right.
So that on the one hand, there's all this working through.
Yep.
And that's part of the trouble. But on the other hand, part of the trouble is that we've already got it all in this, but already from the get-go.
Absolutely.
And that the fact that there was less trouble with having in bearing this is part of the real trouble. So just to get aside.
Absolutely. Part of the trouble, of course, is exactly that. Of course, we take for granted freedom, individuality, equality, natural science, blah, blah, all these things that we're accomplishing this, and to find them troubling again in the right way, to see what kind of achievement they are and how they are worked out, turns out to be different. Okay, let's stop there. You can pick up from me or Rossio your mini commentaries. Other people can hand in mini commentaries. And if you want to have a chat, since the man will get crossed, I'll talk to anyone who wants to have a word outside in the front, since they want to close the building in 10 minutes.